So good morning, everyone. A number of folks are joining us for this webinar on the New York Housing Compact. We do have a lot of information to get through in a very short period of time. So we are actually going to go ahead and get started right at the top. Those of you who don't know me, I'm Tim Foley. I'm the CEO of the Building and Realty Institute. And I want to first introduce all of the organizations that are sponsoring this educational webinar and give them the opportunity to give a word of welcome and greeting. I want to start with Michael Romita of Westchester County Association.
Thanks, Tim, and good morning, everybody. Welcome, and thanks for tuning in this morning on behalf of the WCA, Nonprofit Westchester, Tim's Group, the Building and Realty Institute, and Hagar, the Hudson Gateway Association of Realtors. We're delighted that you've joined us this morning. Together, these groups and others are working in unprecedented fashion to advance a positive pro-housing agenda to benefit our businesses, nonprofits, workers, residents, and communities. Now, this year, things do seem a bit different. The need for more housing, and in particular, affordable and workforce housing, is universally accepted. What is not universally accepted is how we get there. But the contours of the discussion have definitely shifted, and for two primary reasons. First, the clear link between the need for housing and its importance for a strong and vibrant economy. Yes, it's about middle-class opportunity, but it's also about talent acquisition and retention for businesses. It's about making sure that New York State, and Westchester in particular, can remain competitive with our peer states that already have taken action to modernize their laws. As such, New York is falling behind, and in a bad way. Second, the widespread acceptance that zoning and land use are the primary hurdles to resolving the crisis. How we address that hurdle is largely tactical, and that's where the battle lines have been drawn. State-level problems versus local decision-making, carrots versus sticks. There is room for debate and disagreement. The governor deserves credit for spending the political capital to take the issue head-on. Even detractors deserve credit where they engage in rational debate about methods, incentives, and practical challenges. However, there should be no quarter for fear-mongering and bad facts. Whatever short-lived political advantage springs from that does nothing to advance the discussion. This crisis did not spontaneously appear overnight, and it has been building for decades. Each year that we fail to address it, it gets worse, and solving it won't be easy. But here we go. Thanks, Tim. Back to you.
Thanks so much. I now want to call on Jan Fisher of Nonprofit Westchester.
Thank you. And thank you, Michael, for just expressing that so well. To add to that, for Nonprofit Westchester, the issue of affordable housing is critical as we seek to address the impact of decades of systemic racism and redlining. This has limited the possibility of homeownership and wealth building for Black and Brown people, and is something we must address as a society. Additionally, we are motivated to advocate for the nonprofit workforce, the lifeblood of our communities, as they are priced out of Westchester, the rental, and homeownership markets. The Westchester housing crisis needs to be addressed so our workforce, 80% women and 55% people of color, can live and thrive where they work. I'm really grateful to be here and part of the coalition that has been organized by the BRI, Welcome Home Westchester, and I encourage everybody to go on the website and learn a bit more. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. I now want to call on Janet Currier from Hudson Gateway Association of Realtors.
Thank you, Tim, and welcome to everyone that is joining the webinar. For those of you who are not familiar with HGAR, we are the Hudson Gateway Association of Realtors, a real estate trade association and the second largest in New York State. We are 14,000 members strong. HGAR is proud to be working with BRI, WCA, and Nonprofit Westchester under this joint venture of Welcome Home Westchester. Our collective industries and backgrounds have come together to acknowledge the depth of what we are discussing today and offer solutions to our current housing crisis. While the task at hand may appear to be quite challenging, the solutions to the housing crisis do not need to be something to be afraid of. A more affordable and equitable and just society can be achieved. HGAR is proud to be part of an education effort such as this. I hope that this morning's program helps to demystify the fear around possible solutions to growing our communities. Thank you. Tim, back to you.
Thank you so much. All right, so here's how this morning is going to work. We have invited two policy experts to explain the New York Housing Compact as it was presented in the governor's executive budget. Anyone who wants to download the budget memos and legislation itself can do so at any time at budget.ny.gov and look at the Education, Labor, and Family Assistance Bill, particularly parts F through N. That's not all of it, but that's really where the meat of the plan is. We wanted to specifically call on two of the brand names, the leading lights when it comes to housing policy as well as planning. And so we have invited representatives from the Regional Plan Association, Kate Slevin is here, and from the Urban Land Institute Westchester Fairfield chapter, Alec Roberts is here. As moderator, I will ask a number of questions to make sure that we're covering all the bases of the policy contained in those bills. So you'll see a little bit of a back and forth. We will take your questions as submitted by the Q&A tool. It's 3 years into Zoom, so everybody ought to know how to find that. We do have close to 200 registrants, so we will not be able to answer all of your questions, but we'll get through as many as we can with the time that we have. Kate and Alec are housing experts, but they did not write this bill. So oftentimes we'll get a question like, why did you write it this way and not that way? I'm going to tell you right now that has an easy answer. We didn't. Instead, in keeping with the spirit of how we've attempted to approach the issue of housing policy and advocacy within the Welcome Home Westchester campaign, our intent this morning is to educate, not necessarily to cheerlead. Though obviously we're all here because we believe that the housing shortage in Westchester County is a regional crisis that must be addressed. We're really focused this morning on providing real facts and education on what these proposals do and do not do. So we want to start with the problem. You heard a little bit about it in the introductory remarks, but any solution is only functional to the extent that it solves a problem. So I want to start with the question, what is the current state of housing within Westchester County? What does our housing shortage look like and who does it impact? And how has local land use and zoning contributed to that shortage? So I want to start with Alec on that.
Okay, well, first of all, I want to thank you for inviting me to this. I think I know some of you on this call as I fought in the affordable housing wars for about 30 years in Westchester as CEO of Community Housing Innovations. And as I say, I'm very honored that Tim asked me to present today. To give you an idea of the progress we've made, you can start with that. Back in 2010, not too long ago, a great senator and housing advocate, Senator Susie Oppenheimer, managed to get the New York State Legislature to pass a bill requiring Westchester towns and villages to include a 10% affordable housing set aside for new multifamily projects. Westchester municipal officials had wrongly assumed that the Republican Senate would block the bill. The outcry after it was passed, however, was so intense that she had to ask the governor to veto her own bill. We've definitely progressed from there, especially with this legislation, but we have a long way to go to satisfy the need for affordable housing. So I assume most of you are familiar with the 600-page housing needs assessment that's been around for over 3 years. So I'd like to offer a slightly different perspective on what is the most sweeping legislation affecting home rule in recent memory. Let's start with some basics on the housing stock. First of all, Westchester has 345,885 housing units, of which 81% were built before 1979. That's very old by national standards. Yonkers has the most, Buchanan the least. We have a substantial number of public housing units, Section 8 vouchers, rent stabilized units under the ETPA and HSTPA. About 4,500 are severely overcrowded. But let's jump to the problem, which is lack of affordable housing. And how does that manifest itself? Well, 50% of all renters in Westchester are labeled cost burdened by HUD, meaning they pay more than 30% of their income for rent. About 1 in 4 is extremely cost burdened, paying 50% or more of their income. About 1 in 3 homeowners is cost burdened, and about 14% extremely cost burdened. The Housing Needs Assessment found a need for 82,451 affordable units, including nearly 12,000 new units. What types of units? Well, just about everything. If you look at the list, from supportive housing to housing near mass transit to assist our workforce. But no discussion of our housing situation in Westchester would be complete without understanding how we got to this situation. The suburbs were born as a white escape from the city. The housing laws discriminated against Black people with redlining, denial of FHA mortgages, and restrictive covenants. That fueled a huge building boom in Westchester and Long Island until the music stopped with the Fair Housing Act of 1968. That's when home rule became a tool for local towns and villages to drive up the cost of housing through zoning to keep minorities out. The methods included downzoning, stopping multifamily apartment development, and expensive minimum building regulations. How effective has local home rule been in keeping Westchester segregated? We'll take a look at this slide. Westchester is about 13.5% Black. As of 2021, these are the census tracts where African Americans are less than 5% of the population. They're shaded in blue. It's practically nearly all of Westchester except the cities. But cracks started appearing in the last few years, as Michael so eloquently discussed, because while discrimination was a sharp tool, exclusionary zoning is a blunt instrument, and high-priced housing began to affect old people, young people in Westchester and Westchester's employment base. For example, the population of 25 to 34-year-olds showed a decline from 13% in 2000 to about 11% in 2011. Didn't seem like a big deal, and it never raised any alarm bells until in 2014, on one weekend, I started looking at the impact on Westchester's most exclusive communities. Excuse me. The decline in population of millennials and 35 to 44-year-olds in those villages was shocking. My report, Richest Communities on Long Island and in Westchester Experiencing Demographic Collapse of Young Adult Workforce, made the front page of the Journal News and extensive coverage in Newsday and a full page in the New York Times. Spurred by the Westchester HUD consent decree in 2009, a concerted effort was made to develop affordable housing in the predominantly white communities. However, the approach treaded lightly on home rule, as it does to this day, with recent administrations on the state and county level approving billions of dollars in public subsidy to entice these communities into accepting affordable housing. Unfortunately, for the most part, it has not worked because of the myriad of ways home rule may be used to stop even so-called as-of-right development. There's also another consideration. Affordable housing has become prohibitively expensive to develop. The latest projects, which I received courtesy of Norma Drummond, thank you, are costing $500,000 for a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment. And of that, the taxpayer subsidy is about $440,000 a unit. Incidentally, for households with income at or below 60% of the area median income, which is the low income tax credit level, this achieves a rent of $1,883 a month for a 2 bedroom apartment, $1,883 a month. Since the 2 bedroom fair market rent today is $2,029. Our $400,000 plus public investment is reducing the rent in most cases by only $146 a month. So the stage is set for Governor Hochul to propose an overhaul of home rule as the only alternative to economic stagnation and housing unaffordability. As Peter Drucker said, however, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And doubtless Governor Hochul will face a major challenge from suburban legacy culture to hang on to their power.
Thank you so much, Alec. Kate, I want to get you in on the same question.
Sure. Just to start off today, thank you for having me. RPA, for those of you who don't know us, we're a research, planning, and advocacy organization, and we basically work to improve quality of life for the entire New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut metropolitan region. And I want to start off today, even before we get into some of the results of some recent polls that we've done, just to appeal to everyone on the call as a human. I'm sure that, various people have different housing situations, but I want you to think for just a moment about where you live and who's around you and the stories and the experiences of people you know. I'm sure some of you are lucky enough to live comfortably in an apartment or a home and have owned that for a while. Maybe it's a great nest egg for your kids. And then think about who is around you, who's able to live around you if that's your experience, and who isn't, who is not your neighbors, who is working at the local store, who's not able to afford the same things you are. And maybe you're at the other end of the spectrum. Maybe you've had housing insecurity yourself, or you know someone well who has. Maybe someone you work with has been evicted or had a very difficult home situation that has made their living situation precarious. Maybe you're a senior on a fixed income or struggling with property taxes, or a young person really desperately trying to move out of their parents' basement. Or maybe you're a small business who can't find the workers that you need to achieve your mission and your goals. So if you live in Westchester, really anywhere in your region, you're all too familiar with these stories. In other words, I expect almost everyone on this webinar is directly affected by the regional housing crisis, whether you know it or not. And one of the key drivers of this is the lack of different types of homes and a lack of supply of different types of homes, and really an overabundance of single family zone neighborhoods. So today we're going to talk a lot about wonky things like dwelling units per acre and housing targets and many other things, but I think to really have a good discussion around this and really to think about this with an open mind and the future and how we get the change we need, you have to approach it with a level of humility and a level of just being a human in this world who wants to make the world a better place. And right now we're just sort of failing on the housing front to do that and to be basic humans to one another. So anyway, that's a long-winded intro. I wanted to answer Tim's question based on some survey we've done over the past couple years. We actually conducted at RPA 3 surveys over the COVID pandemic, and we wanted to track level of satisfaction, perceived threats to the region, and just the overall COVID recovery in general. And so I'm going to show you a few slides just showing people's perception of housing in particular. This slide here shows what do you think, what the question we asked participants was, what do you think are the most important ways to address inequality in our region? And you can see that more affordable housing is really key here. People were not satisfied with inequality in the region. They saw affordable housing as one of the biggest threats to the future of our region across the board, and crime, ticked up over the third survey, but affordable housing was at the top throughout all 3 surveys. And here, people really understand that to address the legacy we have in this country of historic racism and the inequality that manifests today because of that, as Jan was saying earlier, housing is absolutely fundamental to that. And so I'll move on. If we could just move on to the next slide, please. So we did a public opinion poll in spring of 2022 or fall of 2021, and then again in spring of 2022. And we asked some questions about actual policy tools to address the affordable housing crisis. And despite the rhetoric from last year, you may remember there was a lot of opposition to the governor's proposal last year to legalize accessory dwelling units. We actually saw a pretty significant uptick in support for legalization of basement apartments and accessory dwelling units across the region, most notably in suburban areas. So we were actually surprised by this. You know, when we saw the strongest opposition to that proposal come from Long Island, and here you can see over that period of time when there was really a dialogue and a lot of opposition to the governor's proposal, the public was actually learning about it and support went up. So I wanted to just share that as, you know, for some perspective and some more sort of public opinion polling results we've had over the year to ground a little bit of what we're going to discuss today and what Alec presented earlier.
Thanks so much to both of you. I do want to remind everybody that as we go through this, you should feel free to drop questions into the Q&A tool on Zoom. So let's get into it. This is a budget after all, so let's start with the money. In terms of direct funding, tax incentives, and local property tax options, how does the New York Housing Compact try to encourage and support local communities in ramping up their housing production to address the shortage that you both have described?
Right, so I'll start with that. I mean, right now in the governor's proposal, there's included $250 million for infrastructure improvements to help with meet some of these growth targets to provide the infrastructure needed to build more housing. There's $25 million in there for planning support for localities. And I know there's a lot of discussion about whether these numbers can actually be increased in higher amounts in the final proposal. We know there's a lot of needs, wastewater, local roads, pedestrian safety around train stations, those sorts of things. And so we expect there'll be a discussion around that. Also in the proposal, a locality can choose to opt into a property tax exemption outside of New York City to incentivize affordable housing production for projects with 20% affordable. And that's at 80%, with rents at 80% of AMI. There's an expansion of the property tax exemption specifically for ADUs. So that's accessory dwelling units. So a locality can opt in again to an exemption on the increase in assessed value of 1 and 2 family homes as the result of creating an ADU. So in essence, you won't be punished if you actually do decide to pursue an ADU. And there's also a number of New York City specific incentives, and these are largely around rehabs and commercial to residential conversions. And we see that as vitally important as well. And though not in Westchester, obviously we want to have a thriving Manhattan, and a Manhattan where we have a future plan for what we're going to do if there is vacant office space. So we see that as a crucial part of the solution as well.
Can I just ask you to explain one thing? I know we have a general audience here on the webinar today, so they may not be familiar when it comes to affordability with terms like 80% AMI. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, that's 80% of area median income. So that's the median income of everyone, all the households in the region, and that's how the housing targets, housing rents and such are set. Great,
thank you. All right, the next question. The governor sets up a new housing planning office within the governor's plan sets up a new housing planning office within the Division of Homes and Community Renewal. Alec, what would that new office do?
Well, thanks, Tim. One of the major difficulties with legislation that seeks to turn around the local zoning ship in Westchester or anywhere else is that there are 45 independent ships, 6 cities, 16 towns, 23 villages. Each has authority over all planning and zoning when it comes to approving site plans, subdivisions, and even the ability to enact environmental regulations. So To say it's complicated would be an understatement, especially for volunteer land use boards. Now, the Westchester Department of Planning has done a great job trying to provide guidance, but they're not adequately staffed to service 45 entities. The Pace Land Use Law Center historically has been invaluable in providing courses on planning for public servants and volunteers on the various boards, such as the Board of Trustees, Planning Board, Zoning Board of Appeals. But board members are volunteers, not planners, and they must get advice from professionals, which is very expensive. And as Kate mentioned, there's about $20 million available for technical assistance to local jurisdictions. But in order to enforce such a massive plan that the governor has proposed, the governor has set up a budget for $4 million to establish a housing planning office in the Division of Homes and Community Renewal. Now, it is tasked to support local municipalities in meeting their housing goals and coordinate planning efforts. It will also serve as the repository for extensive new reporting requirements for all cities, towns, and villages. And it's a laundry list: number of new housing units built, number of housing units converted, consolidated, altered, demolished, the total number of housing units in the municipality, the schedule of approvals for any housing approved that year, any government subsidies used in creating new housing, and finally, the municipality's zoning maps. Now, those zoning maps, for every year, they have to provide location, number of units, building type, approval, permit, completion dates, government subsidies, development details, and permits. So you can see this is very extensive to match all of the targets for the bills. And finally, each jurisdiction has to file these maps showing where different types of development are permitted or prohibited, which residential zones allow for 2, 3, or 4 or more dwelling units per lot, and for residential buildings, any requirements pertaining to minimum lot size, identifying geographic bounds of zoning areas amended, reasons for prohibiting residential development wherever it is prohibited, and designation of whether zoning approvals are done as of right or subject to discretionary review. And then they have a catch-all saying that any other information the commissioner of DHCR may deem relevant. So no more can municipality just submit a comprehensive plan, update it without accountability for results. This is really a huge change. It's going to be a massive new responsibility for all localities that have zoning jurisdiction.
Timmy, take yourself off mute.
Thank you so much.
There you go.
Very good. All right. So those are the appetizers. Now on to the main course. Part F of the Education, Labor, and Family Assistance budget is what really establishes the outline of the New York Housing Compact, including the responsibilities for generating new housing. It's titled Promoting Housing Statewide Through Local Growth Targets, Safe Harbor, and Fast Track. Alec, I'm going to go back to you. Can you walk us through that?
Okay, actually 5 minutes. I'll run it through you, but I assume you'll be able to make some of the slides available so you know, people can kind of digest it. This is a big one. So if the past 30 years have been aspirational for setting goals for affordable and multifamily housing with targets, allocation plans, and of course, expressions of heartfelt concern with little or no consequences for failure, the governor's bold legislation is perspirational. And what I mean by that is the New Homes Targets and Fast Track Approval Act will make those responsible for making zoning decisions sweat if they don't meet the act's goals. So the governor's plan is nothing like the state has ever seen before in its unvarnished challenge to home rule, or one would say modifications. The purpose of the legislation is succinctly described. This bill promotes new housing statewide through the establishment of new home targets in each city, town, and village, and fast tracks project approvals in localities that do not meet the growth targets or that fail to implement certain land use actions that promote housing growth. Pretty straightforward. Now, the housing targets, which are going to be measured in the form of building permits, will be set in 3-year cycles beginning January 1st, 2024. And the baseline will be the existing housing stock as of the 2020 census. So localities in Westchester will have 3% growth targets for the first cycle, which ends December 31st, 2027. The targets must be met with building permits, not projects in the pipeline. Each newly created unit will count as 1 towards the growth target, but there will be bonuses. For example, newly permitted units created at properties that had previously been certified as abandoned pursuant to Article 19A will count as 1.5 units. Similarly, newly permitted affordable housing or supportive housing units will count as 2 units towards the growth target. So long as the target is met, the locality has what's called safe harbor. It doesn't have to suffer any consequences. But if the targets are not met, they're going to be subject to a fast-track approvals process for certain development projects for the next 3-year cycle. The most controversial part of that includes the following. The locality will be barred in the subsequent 3-year cycle from using non-compliance with existing land use requirements to reject projects proposed on previously developed land that meet unit count and affordability criteria established in the bill. The bill limits the considerations that localities can weigh in reviewing such proposals and exempts the projects from state and local environmental review, though they still must obtain all required state and federal permits. The bill punishes the locality by removing its home rule power almost completely. However, there is a loophole, which I suspect many Westchester jurisdictions facing loss of their powers might take. The offending locality has the option of passing just 2 of 5 so-called preferred actions enumerated in the bill, and the passing of any of the preferred actions would not be subject to state or local environmental review. So what are they? Those preferred actions include permitting accessory dwelling units, facilitating lot splits, removing certain restrictive zoning, allowing certain density levels over a portion of previously developed areas, and rezoning a specified amount of commercial areas to also allow for housing. In addition, there's another safety valve. If a municipality has failed to meet its targets or pass 2 of the preferred actions, they can appeal that loss of their home rule powers to review projects to a new housing review board in DHCR. The legislation states, however, that the burden of proof will be on the locality to prove they're in safe harbor due to having grown by the requisite level or taken the preferred actions, the proposed project not being a qualifying project, or having properly denied the proposal for reasons permitted by the bill. Another safeguard for the municipality is that, and this is important, the Housing Review Board determinations can be appealed to an administrative law judge and then can be appealed to a court via Article 78. So the appeals process potentially could last years, with the additional carrot that localities also can show that they've built enough units in the current and previous cycle to now hit the growth targets for the previous cycle as an affirmative defense. The hope, as stated in the bill memo, is to make all cities, towns, and villages in New York partners in the process for meeting the state's critical housing needs.
Alec, I want to ask one quick follow-up question on that with regard to the fast track approval, because I think this is a point that often gets lost in the shuffle. It's not fast track approval for anything and everything that could possibly be built within the community. It's, for example, would not apply to luxury condominiums. Is there a specific affordability requirement?
Yes, definitely. They have to address at least the affordability for 80% of the area median income, and you know, they hope to do it, reach the lower levels as well.
And if I'm not much mistaken, the percentages that they're looking for, in Westchester County, we have a lot of communities that have a 10% set aside. This would be an affordability level that's actually higher than that in order to get the fast track approval.
Right, right.
Great. So to be clear, as we said at the top, we need all kinds of housing of all shapes, sizes, and price points to meet the needs of all of our residents. And that's been clear from the Westchester County Housing Needs Assessment in 2019. But a lot of folks are focused, rightly so, we've gotten some questions already within the Q&A, on affordable workforce housing. Kate, can you go over again how the New York Housing Compact Plan focuses on affordable housing specifically?
Sure. As Alec mentioned, there's the 3% growth target over 3 years. And if you have affordable housing, those units count as double. So the affordable units count as double. So you're essentially looking at a 1.5 growth target if you do all affordable, say. Additionally, abandoned units, if they're rehabbed, they count as 1.5. Towards the growth rate. So that's also important. And just to put a fine point on it, for the fast track process, if a municipality doesn't meet their growth targets by 2027 and they don't pass 2 of those preferred actions, right? A developer can petition the state or a court to build a project, right? But that project has to have an affordable component, like you're saying. It can't just be market rate. And it has to be 25% affordable units for 80% of area median income, or the deeper level, which Alec referred to, of 20% at very low income. That would be 50% of area median income.
Great. So again, one of the questions we got was specifically looking at bands that are 50% area median income. So there is that provision which is targeted at it. The last piece that is relevant to us in Westchester County is Part G of the Alpha Bill, transit-oriented development. Kate, can you walk us through that?
Sure, and I'm going to ask you to bring up the second part of my slides here. Another key part of the compact is essentially proposing a transit-oriented development mandate for local zoning changes. And transit-oriented development is really a vital part of any kind of future growth strategy, because you're more likely to be able to live a lower carbon lifestyle if you are able to live near transit. Because usually the areas around transit are likely to be more walkable. You're more likely to be able to take the train to work or to other activities. And so the compact would allow more housing and actually mandate rezoning for housing in places that make sense, near transit and within already developed areas. And it would achieve it by allowing communities to figure out what works for them. And I think part of the reason we really like this bill is because it gives localities options on how to meet these broader goals, right? And so here is what is in the compact as it stands. Within a half mile around a subway or commuter rail station, and this is just for in the MTA coverage area, which obviously includes Westchester, the dwelling unit per acre, so that's sort of how many apartments or houses there are per acre, would have to achieve 50 dwelling units per acre within a distance of 0 to 15 miles. And in a minute, I'll show you a map that illustrates this visually. The second tier would mandate 30 dwelling units per acre within a half mile of a train station. And that's up to 30 miles away from New York City. The third tier would be up to 50 miles, and that's 20 dwelling units per acre. And then the fourth tier is, 50 miles or more, and that's 15 dwelling units per acre. And to be clear, this is what zoning would have to be on average within a half mile of a train station. So your community could decide to have higher zoning right next to the train station and preserve lower density zoning farther away, for example. So it's really up to each municipality to figure out what kind of zoning or change makes sense to meet this mandate. So can we go to the next slide, please? So here's a visual of sort of what we're talking about. Subway stations are included. They're not visually represented on this map, probably because there's too many of them. But here you see the first band with the density of 50 dwelling units per acre, includes about half of Westchester. And then the second band, where you go to 30 dwelling units per acre around train stations, is includes most of the rest of Westchester. And then a couple stations in the far north are down to the 20 dwelling units per acre threshold. And the municipalities just have to show that they've done the rezoning by, I think it's the 2027 deadline. So then after that, it will take a while for those projects, if they even happen, to come to realization. So this is a long-term approach here, and it will take a number of years to actually see changes around train stations. And many, well, I don't know the exact number of municipalities meeting the targets already, but you know, given the interest in doing transit-oriented development already in Westchester and in other parts of the region, you could assume that some places are already meeting the mandates that's in this legislation. So if you can move on, I just have a couple images I wanted to show. Oh, well, first of all, if you're not sure about what dwelling units per acre means, here's sort of a little cheat sheet, and it's really, really important, the design. I mean, you all know that from your professional work, that it really matters what these buildings and what these housing units look like. A design of a unit can make a pretty low density development look terrible and feel bigger than it is, or it can make a relatively high density development seem, you know, like it you know, sort of just fits in. So it really, really matters what the design is, where it's placed, you know, on it, next to the train station or farther away, how it interacts with what else is going on in the community. So next slide, please. I wanted to show you this. This is just an example of that our colleagues at Open New York put out, of what 15 dwelling units per acre could look like. Again, design is everything. So there's a bunch of different ways you could actually meet that mandate. The exempt land in the legislation that does not count, this is just looking at residentially zoned land, parks and cemeteries, historic districts, highways, water, wetlands, and floodplains, and other unbuildable land. So this gives you a sense, 50 dwelling units per acre might sound like a lot, but this doesn't look that scary, and it actually looks like a lot of communities in the region. And that just gives you a sense. And then if you just move on to the next slide, on the you know, out in Patchogue and Long Island, they've done a lot of TOD. They're a little bit farther from New York City, and they're more at sort of 20 dwelling units per acre, a little bit higher. Next slide. And then there's been sort of this myth for years about TOD. Oh, we're going to end up looking like the city, and we don't want to look like the city, blah, blah, blah. And I want to just point out that if you're looking at, this is a very dense area in Long Island City, Queens, this is 181 dwelling units per acre. So there's a way to achieve the 50 dwelling units per acre without looking like the city. And then if you go to the last slide here, and if anyone is familiar with Woodside, Queens, these are, you know, this is it's about 73 dwelling units per acre around the subway station there. And, you know, they're largely lower structures. You know, the buildings there, the houses there are, you know, often 2 to 3 stories, some 4 stories. And, you know, 1 or 2 families in many of them. And this is 73 dwelling units per acre just because it's a very consistent density. You know, there aren't that many parks around the station, for example. There's no cemeteries or other things like that. So I just want to point out, urban densities can be much, much higher than 50 units per acre. And there's many ways to achieve the 50 units per acre. And obviously, if it's less than that, like the 30 or 20 units per acre, it's even easier to achieve. And that's all I got.
Thanks. I do want to just follow up on one particular point. Again, the TOD zoning, number one, we think that there are a number of communities that are already achieving that level of density around their train stations, although we clearly haven't enumerated all of them. But number two, this is not a requirement to build that maximum amount of possible units. It's a requirement to have zoning that would allow for a density along those lines. Is that correct?
That's right. Thanks for the clarification. And like I said, after the rezoning takes place, it could be many years or it could be never, right? Until those buildings are actually built. It's just what's mandated in the state is getting the zoning in place around the train station, specifically for the residential portion.
Fantastic. So first of all, thank you both so much. I think that was very, very thorough. Hopefully a lot of folks have had the opportunity to take some notes. We obviously are recording this as well. I want to get to some of the questions that we have. There is looks like one of the actually, it looks like Assemblyman Steve Otis had asked, and I'll just repeat the question, even though I think you answered it. If a municipality has already met the transit-oriented development components, allowing up to 50 units per acre near the MTA train station, did they get a credit for that, or does that municipality have to continue to add more additional units?
I mean, my reading of the legislation, and Alec and Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, is that they'd be good on the TOD part, and potentially, given how much, depending on how much has been going to be built beyond that, they would be on a good track to meet the growth targets.
Well,
the TOD portion and the growth targets are separate. They're seen as separate in the legislation. Right.
And Steve, the issue with that would be that they're going to count all the way back from 2020 in terms of meeting the targets, so that a city like White Plains, which has been building thousands of units, they're going to get all that credit for the units that they built since 2020. I'm in 2020. So they should be in pretty good shape.
We have a number of questions relating to affordability, so I'm going to try and pick one of them that's representative. I hope there will be some attention to the 80% AMI target group and the need for addressing those under 50% and lower, including under 30%. Do we need more attention to the lower ends of those percentages?
Oof.
Well, I think the obvious answer is yes.
And
I think one of the things that we've been saying is that we need housing of all different shapes and sizes at all different price points. And this is certainly one of the bigger concerns. As previously mentioned, there is a lot that targets to 80%. There's additional things that do target to 50%. I do think when you're getting to under 30%, that always tends to be the hardest from a policy perspective to sort of support at the levels that we clearly need it.
Right.
Yeah, Tim, I'll just chime in and say, obviously, the lower ends of the affordability spectrum are critical, but the governor was pretty savvy and wise, I think, in tackling this issue as a housing crisis generally, because that is a critical crux of the problem. It's not just the most vulnerable, which is very important, but there's a workforce element here that is necessary for our businesses to thrive, because otherwise we're choking off talent to those businesses.
I would say,
sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was going to say that there are ways to get to the more affordable levels other than building new units, which is a proposal that I submitted and has been endorsed by BRI, which is to go into the existing market, paying landlords a lump sum for their existing apartments to bring the rents down further. It would be less expensive than spending $500,000 for a new unit.
Next
Yeah,
question.
and one thing I should mention is that last year there was a 5-year housing plan that was authorized. And so that's, investing something like 25 billion, I believe is the number, over 5 years. So this isn't the only thing that's out there. There's already things that happened last year that are in the works.
Tim,
I'm not saying it's enough, but it's a start at least.
Tim, I just want to add one thing too. The 30% AMI and the workforce aren't two mutually exclusive groups. There are plenty of people who are 30% AMI and under, who are really hardworking people, who are just really underpaid as well.
That's a great point. Next question. What happens if there are some bad years in terms of housing production? National recession or some local problems can cause development to grind to a halt. That's not just theoretical. I'll say that that is exactly what the region experienced and the nation experienced in 2009, 2010. So how does the New York Housing Compact allow for that? I think the answer is this is something that we need to look at. Because again, the goal is currently on building, the 3% target is specifically on building permits, and again, not things on the pipeline. Some of the rezonings in the safe harbor would obviously be an off-ramp for folks who are not going to meet their targets for reasons beyond their control. But I do think that's one of the things that we have to look at. We do know that there is an intense desire to build housing. There are a number of projects that are in the pipeline 2 to 4 years, according to some of the research that we have done, particularly multifamily, but also, some of these more gentle density projects. So there's clearly a pent-up demand and desire, but you can only control the economy so much, and that's something that perhaps ought to be taken a look at.
Yeah, and I think we believe the 1 and 3% targets are over 3 years are very achievable. And so, I think that's a good place to start. I do think it's a good question that should be brought up that's posed there, but I think they're very, very achievable, especially given the need and given what we've seen occur over the past several years in our region.
And I think it's also fair to say that there are something on the order of about a dozen communities that are already on track just on their present trajectory based on what they've built since the census year of 2020, or based on recent rezonings that they have passed. 12, a dozen is pretty good, but we have about, as Alex said, 4 dozen municipalities. So it's a lot to juggle.
Right. And looking statewide, I think for many municipalities, this is going to mean, 100 units or so over 3 years or less. Right. Obviously, it'll be different for parts of Westchester, but like I said, it's very attainable, a very achievable goal.
There's a question: how does allowing housing in commercial zoning differ from 1930s redlining that made Black neighborhoods commercial and subjected generations of families to environmental hazards? Anyone want to take a stab on that? So one thing that I can say, I think the rezoning pieces that we're talking about are twofold. Within the New York Housing Compact, we're mostly talking about the safe harbor provisions. And most of the rezoning that's talked about commercial to residential are things that are not industry. So we're not talking about things with natural environmental hazards like, factories or so on and so chemical plants or what have you. We are talking more about conversion from unused hotel space or unused office space into residential. So those obviously would not have the same level of environmental hazards because people are already working there on a pretty daily basis or staying there in the case of hotels.
And communities, and communities under home rule will presumably can decide where they want to do that development, where it is appropriate. Right. So if there are hazards, they won't develop those properties as residential housing.
Right. I mean, I think that's the answer, is that it's up to the community to make sure that they're developing in the right places and that they are protecting its citizens. There's a lot here that's still left to the localities to make decisions for themselves about how to meet the growth targets. And again, that's one of the reasons I think it's a smart approach and why we like it.
And if I recall correctly, one of even the most fast-tracky measures makes various exceptions related to public health and safety. So that's always a recourse.
Yeah, and also design considerations as well is in there. And there's also some provisions for infrastructure as well. So there is some more detail in there that addresses concerns people have about health, safety, infrastructure, design. We'll see how that gets worked out in the final bit of legislation, but right now there is a lot of language in there about that.
I think this ought to be a quick one. What is the mileage from New York City measured from?
That is a really good question. And I actually asked my staff that this morning. I'm presuming it's Midtown Manhattan, but I have not gotten clarity on that yet.
It didn't look like it when you put that map up, because I had the same question. It looked like it was from the Bronx, because it goes all the way up to almost the the expressway. So
I know, and that's the governor's slide. So we need to get clarity on that, where exactly they're starting from in New York, because I had assumed it was Midtown, and then I looked at this slide this morning and had the exact same question.
Right.
As I recall, the memo seems to suggest that it's from the border of New York City, but I don't know that it's specified with clarity within the enacting legislation itself.
Right, but the map shows it's the border, so the Bronx.
I was right, because I don't know is a very quick answer. Next question. I love this mock-up. What about the issue of parking, which is coming up as a huge issue? I believe because it's mock-up, we're talking specifically about transit-oriented development.
So the question's about parking availability near train stations?
I think so.
Yeah, I mean, look, that is such underutilized space. And there's a variety of other ways that, in the future we'll be able to get to train stations. Having a sea of parking around a train station is the most frustrating thing. If you care about the environment and you care about, livability, and you care about, just basically growing in a way that it makes sense for society and for future environmental health. So a lot of places have started to redevelop on their parking lots, and that is a prime target, I think, for future development. That can, a surface parking, I think, is some of the most egregious. Tiered, stacked parking, multi-level parking makes a lot more sense if you're going to have parking around the train station. And in the future, ideally more people live around the train. There's other ways to get to and from the train that are safe and affordable. And so we don't want to preclude a future like that, right? We want to encourage that sort of transition.
All right.
But I mean, and a lot of places have built the structured parking next to the train station if they're building on a surface parking lot.
So, I'm sorry, the person gave me a clarification. Not parking at the train station, parking for the new ADUs.
Oh, I think there's no mandate for new parking if there is availability of street parking, but you are allowed to have one unit if there isn't availability of street parking in front.
I think you mean one parking space.
Sorry, one parking space. Sorry, there was some background noise here. I got distracted for a minute.
No worries. With apologies to everybody, we have 23 questions in the queue and 3 minutes. So we're going to try and squeeze in one before we say goodbye. Are the municipalities being supported to facilitate and develop the infrastructure to support a growing housing population, like schools, police stations, fire stations, etc.?
Well, in terms of infrastructure, they have 250 million set aside to help with that for the municipalities. But again, in some municipalities, the numbers of school children have declined. So every community is different. And so the way that they implement some of these targets is going to be different.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and a lot of the housing that's actually driving up the school children enrollment is the single family homes, because you have seniors who can't afford to stay there, so they leave earlier than they want to, and then they're replaced with a family with three kids. So I don't tend to buy into that narrative that, oh, we can't have more school kids, because if they're not educated in your community, then where are they going to be educated? I like to, we want to welcome people into our communities. But when you look at the statistics, it's actually the apartment buildings are much less likely to draw families than the single family homes.
Yeah, and just to put a plug for our own work at the Welcome Home Westchester campaign, last year at this time, we released a report looking about what not hypothetically could happen, but what actually did happen when multifamily of a certain size was built, not even in the cities, but specifically within the towns and villages. That report is available on our website, but the two top line answers were, in every case, the number of school children within that building was less than what was predicted, and a tiny percentage of the number of students enrolled within the school district. As Alex said, actually, most of those school districts as a whole had their census decline over time, because that's what's happening in Westchester County when you have 25 to 35-year-olds not coming into the county because they can't find affordable housing. And then the second thing we actually found was that there was substantial surpluses as a direct result for school district taxes based upon the construction of those, which stands to reason. If you figure it's mostly not school children with those buildings, as indeed it is not, all the other residents are still paying taxes for children that are not being educated in the school system because they don't live there. So again, it is 10 o'clock. I want to thank so much our two presenters today, Alec Roberts and Kate Slevin. Obviously, there are a lot of details that are currently being hashed out as part of the budget process. That is important. That is what the budget process is for. Typically, when you're talking about numbers, the question is it too high, too low, or is it achieving the direct target? It's the same with this plan as with any other part of the budget. That's what our legislators are for. So we want to encourage everybody, based on the information you received from us and from others, to reach out to their state legislators. That's if you have a perspective on building the housing we need in Westchester, if you have a particular concern, if you have something particular that you think needs to be shored up, please reach out to them, make your voice heard. Secondly, we want to recommend that people sign up for Welcome Home Westchester updates. And you can go to our website to do that, www.welcomehomewestchester.org. That's where you'll also find a number of the reports that we've put out about the state of housing within Westchester County and the economic benefits for municipalities and school districts of building the housing we need. And lastly, if you're with another organization or community group or others that you think would benefit from a presentation like this one, or on the needs of housing in Westchester more broadly, including who is currently shut out of housing and why, let us know. We'd be happy to help organize something. With that, I want to thank everybody who participated today, and everybody have a fantastic morning.